in my world, AI is something that has actually existed for quite a long time, has certainly come around, has developed a lot recently. Large, huge technological leap, of course, and the popularity and well-known nature of like ChatGPT, other services that are out and more increasingly used by everybody, has made a huge difference. But in my world, like 10 years ago, we were talking about different versions of AI, but still AI. And to me, this speaks to like, what is AI? Like, do we have a common definition that we're even talking about? And I don't think we really do. There's just, it doesn't lend itself to having a common definition. Perhaps if it's ever regulated, we'll start to have buckets that we're putting types of AI in. But in my boat, in my world, from my perspective, the client financial institution that I have worked with that uses like a phone system that can listen to your voice, understand what that means, and direct you to the right place is actually just a version of AI. Like that ChatGPT and all of what's in the limelight here right now is only fueling that, I think. So super interested. Hope the conversation is going to be interesting, and I've been following this for a while, so I'm excited to talk about it.
So in some ways it's almost like nothing changed, but in some ways it's like everything changed.
Yeah, it's like it's an explosion in popularity. It's an explosion in understanding, right? Just like a year ago, if we were talking about language models or even just artificial intelligence, I'd back up several steps, but before even getting to like what's the potential definition. At least here, folks attending today, it's like I'm guessing you know what ChatGPT is, right? Like you probably have heard of that. You guys, we sent out email blasts today that was like, did you see the hearing on Capitol Hill? It's like nobody was following the CEO of ChatGPT's or OpenAI's feelings on whether AI should be regulated previously, or at least. Well, I wouldn't assume that the group would know about that previously. So it's certainly an explosion of understanding of what AI can do. It's an explosion. It's like a technological leap, certainly in accessibility and ease of use and audience. And so yeah, it's super interesting. But a lot of the issues, the legal issues that I think about. Are actually pretty similar to what they have been for a number of years. They've just also exploded a little bit.
Before we get into legal issues, so here, startups are here building the future. Where do you see AI in 6 months, and then look out farther, 10 years, if you can even take a venture to guess out there?
Yeah, well, so the immediate next steps, right, are, right now, the conversation is like, okay, I'm using a language model. Go back to ChatGPT. It has flaws, right? It has issues. You ask it to, imagine a physical scenario, and you drop a block next to another block that's raised up, and it doesn't understand that, gravity is going to drop it down, right? Like it's relatively what seem like simple things don't necessarily always work. It reminds me of being in like high school and teachers saying, don't use Wikipedia as a source. It contains all sort of false information. Anybody could edit Wikipedia. And now we look at that as like a positive, right? You may not use it as your end most authoritative source, but right, like it's like a good start if you want some background on a basic or even relatively niche issue. I think that's kind of where I see us right now, maybe a step or two past that, but we're at this point where everybody has these kind of basic doubts that are being raised about some of the usefulness of AI in its most popularized form. And then also these much deeper, more inherent to the technology concerns about like ethics and security and is it possible that we will integrate these systems into things that could physically cause people harm, like objects of war, for example. And so I think the initial phase here that we're in will be addressing some of the inconsistencies, the inaccuracies, the basic problems right now while the technology continues to advance. That's the near term. And then the next step, and what we're seeing, the conversation is already addressing, but it's going to take quite a while to really work through, is this ethics piece. It's the safety piece. It's should we be worried about AI being sentient? Maybe, I don't know. And how would you do that? Is it even possible to regulate that? That's kind of the next step. Actually imagining all of the different ways that the technology is going to
start at a high level, from a U.S. perspective or from a global perspective, and talk about some of the legal and ethical implications before zooming down to the individual ethical and legal implications. So what's at the global level? How should entrepreneurs, what's important for them to be thinking about in terms of the regulatory landscape and how are things going to develop, and what's important to consider?
Yeah. So high level, there are several buckets of things to think about. On the highest level, one thing that I'll say before I get to specific categories of legal type of issues is when we're talking about new technologies, when we're talking about technologies that clearly have a variety of legal and risk-based implications, and we're not yet regulated, which is the space that most AI is in, you should assume, and yesterday's headlines are if you need something to underscore this, then look at hearings on Capitol Hill and all that. There will be more regulations, right? We won't be able to predict exactly what they are or how they're going to regulate AI or the types of checks and balances that are going to be put in place. But creating new technology with a mind toward are we doing the right thing here as people is a really good perspective to have if you want to avoid regulators knocking at your door and saying what are we doing here? Should we be regulating this? Should we be scrutinizing this more than regulating this? So I'm always a fan of from the outset thinking about how should we be doing this in a way that's just appropriate as humans, okay? From there are certain buckets of issues that are useful to think about when we're talking about AI and developing AI and the legal issues that surround it. General liability concerns, right? So if you're creating a self-driving car, maybe we should think about who's going to be responsible if it hits somebody, right? Obvious issue, not surprising to anybody, but translate that into whatever else we have going on, right? If you have a language model that's maybe designed for a specific purpose, not just a really broad general purpose like a ChatGPT. Let's say it's designed to provide healthcare advice. Who's going to be responsible for that advice? And also then, does that mean that we should add in some checks and balances? Does a doctor then probably need to review what the step 2 is, before or after that language is provided to a patient? So the liability concerns are kind of the obvious one. Intellectual property is a big one, and this goes in a few different directions. Can you even own or protect your ownership in something that AI has itself been a part of making? In some aspects of intellectual property, the answer is actually probably not. And what I mean is if you use AI to help you code, or if you're using AI to develop your product or service, and it's the foundation, what it spits out is the foundation of your product or service. There's an open question and a lot of doubt as to whether you can patent something that was created by AI, for example. There are other types of protections, intellectual property protections, that are very important and could be useful, even in the absence of patent. But patent is certainly a really strong protection, and if you're creating something of value, you probably want to think about whether you can protect it and even own it in the first place, or else somebody else can just come around and say, no, I'm going to use this however I want. So that's one. Data privacy and cybersecurity is a piece of my practice, and so I naturally go to think about this. But it's a really interesting area in the AI space because in sort of two directions. One is AI itself runs a little bit in conflict with some of the typical pressures and considerations in play with data privacy laws and regulations that are out there. What do I mean by that? In order to build a really good AI system, depending on how, what we're trying to do, think of, again, back to ChatGPT, shove as much language into the system, let it learn what that is, direct it to do some things, and help it spit out useful information, right? Where does that information come from? Where does all of the language that teaches a language model come from? In a lot of cases, it's publicly available language, right? Well, if what you're doing is scraping publicly available information off of the internet, you can assume that publicly available information, you have the consent to build a business or an AI system based off of that. But that's not necessarily like consent. Like just because something happens to be public doesn't mean that somebody wanted it to be public, or that you have somebody's consent to use their language to build your system. So there's kind of this open, unchallenged, unlitigated question that I think is sort of an elephant in the room with a lot of these services as to whether there's going to be like significant legal challenges as to their very existence, because they were built off of all of this publicly available language. We've seen something super similar with like Facebook and now Meta using its training its facial recognition system on just like all of the photos that you uploaded to Facebook, and said, I think they took the position that they could only use the ones that were public, but that doesn't mean that you're necessarily giving somebody permission to commercialize your images, right? So interesting in that aspect. Also on the data privacy side of things, just sort of the consent mechanism, even if you're not using public information, if you're working with individuals who are using your service, do they know that have you disclosed to them basically that they will be helping to build your service? Basically, these are privacy terms and conditions and terms there, issues like that.
Does she own it?
Yeah. So you certainly have rights in something that is created through like a ChatGPT, through a similar service, similar model. The issue comes, if we're doing something for like hobby purposes, or like you're just interested,
or you're
sure,
startup,
go ahead.
You're building an app.
Right, and that's where I'm going. Like, if it's a hobby, you're probably not super concerned, right? Next step, there's some value here. People might pay for this, or I want to develop this further into something that's of additional value that I can license or I can sell. There will be a question as to whether your model, your service, your software, your code was created writ large by AI. If you don't disclose that to the USPTO when you file for your protection, whether that's patent or oftentimes software, we would look to potentially patent, but often it's copyright. The USPTO's current position on this is that in general, you need, like, a patent can only be, a patentable object must have been created by a natural person. So not AI, basically. AI is not a natural person. Of whether non-human things can create objects that humans can then own, basically. So yeah, like, can you own a tree that has, like, intellectual, in a sense of intellectual property? The answer right now is that the USPTO's position is probably not. That is going to be litigated further, no doubt. So, you know, the USPTO is a regulator, essentially, in this space. They're not the necessarily the be-all, end-all final say. They're certainly very influential, but this will be probably further regulated and probably also litigated. And I think the issue is a little open. What we want to think about here, though, more practically speaking, is if you have ChatGPT spit out some code, there's a pretty good chance that you're not just using that writ large and then selling it. You're probably going to do a few more things to it. You're going to tweak it. You're going to have some whether it's experienced or knowledgeable about how to code, how to create software, or somebody that you hire, or somebody that you're working with the company that you're creating. They're going to tweak it, and everybody starts with some base code, like whether you learned it when you were learning how to code, or you learned it from experience and you're pulling it from template. You're not creating everything totally from scratch. And so you go a few iterations, a few steps down the road, and eventually maybe it's not something that was created by AI, for example. And now we're at a position where, like, yeah, that's protectable. I would file for a copyright or seek ownership and IP protection for that without much hesitation or concern, or giving a million disclaimers to my client if we go in that direction. So that's the more practical side of this, is like you're not just screwed, basically, by creating something through AI. It boils down to what we're using AI for. If we're using it to summarize, information and then put it out there, blog posts, emails, I see no issue with it, especially with the understanding that you're probably going to at least give it a once over, right? Like, maybe not, maybe I shouldn't assume that, but like, you'll probably at least like read it or give it a once over to ensure that it's something that is tied to the name of your
Depends on
company.
how long it is. I mean, how much time do you have? You're going to read the whole thing?
Sure, right,
if it's
that's
a tweet,
true.
You got it. If it's a whole book,
My recommendation would be, the more significant the outcome of the use of AI, the more caution you should take, basically. That's like the simple, obvious, easy to say rule of thumb. But to flesh that out, like, I'll give you an example. I've used ChatGPT in my legal practice myself. Here's how I use it. Have an email that I need to send to a client to discuss language that we're going to send to a vendor where we're in like a contract dispute. Okay. I know myself. You can probably get the sense from me that I am prone to be a little wordy from time to time. I have used ChatGPT to drop in a stripped out, personal informationized, anonymized version of what I want to say. Dropped it in and said, like, here are some goals that I have. Here are some things I'd like some help with this draft. Please either revise it or suggest revisions or critique my work. And it's really helpful in that sense. But that's like me integrating it into a supervised drafting process when I spend lots of time during my day drafting language. That's like, I see little risk in that, basically. If all I did was say, spit out a new version of this and now I'm just going to send it without thinking about it, like, would you hire me knowing that that's what I'm doing? I would recommend some caution if the answer was yes. So it depends on what we're using it for. Sorry to give you the it depends lawyer answer, but
how
it's
critical it is to your business and the survival of your business.
Yeah, exactly. Like, how valuable is the thing that you're making? Is it content for the sake of like engagement and understanding the kinds of things you're thinking about? Yeah, okay. We probably aren't super concerned about the legal ramifications of a couple paragraph blog post that you've at least given a quick proof on. Is it health care advice that you're providing through an app? Yeah, probably want to give that a little bit more scrutiny as to like what it says. Those are obviously the easy sides of the spectrum to be talking about, but like illustrative of where my head is at this point as to how we're using AI. I am not the attorney who's going to tell you don't use AI. I'd be pushing against a brick wall or trying to fight a moving train to tell you not to use AI, not to mention just the value that is obvious and clear here. It's just like, let's be mindful, let's think about what we're doing. It's like, should we be doing this in this way? What are the checks and balances that need to be in place, basically?
I'm so glad to hear you're not going to stop it from using AI.
I couldn't even if I wanted to. Like, it's the reality here, right? Like, it's too valuable.
In privacy.
Yeah. So there's a few angles on this. First of all, so in my position, when I think about this for myself, I agree to every client who I work with that I will keep your information private. Like, that is a contractual responsibility. That is a attorney ethics responsibility that I could, have an issue with my licensure with the state of Michigan. It's also just like good practice, though, more than anything else that I care about. Like, I don't want that to be an issue for you, and so more than anything else, I'm thinking about the fact that like you probably don't want, or we haven't talked through whether you consent to me giving that information to a third party, even if it's a vendor. So I mentioned that to think about, where are you in your space when you're using AI? Are you in a position where, it's a position of trust, or a position of regulation, or a position of like ethics, where we need to think about what has been consented to as it relates to the information that you're using and plugging it into AI. Also matters what AI we're talking about. So for example, there are a number of AI-based vendors, software vendors, other types of vendors that before you use their product, you agree to terms. It might be a privacy policy. It more likely, perhaps, is even like a direct contractual relationship. I'm paying you for these services. There's a contract in place. I negotiate these agreements all the time. And one thing that I'm always looking for is like, what are the data privacy implications? Are we taking healthcare information? Are we taking financial information and plugging it in? If all we're doing is plugging in like, information necessary to build a business, and we're not concerned about some of those ownership issues, the data privacy implications probably aren't that significant necessarily. But the moment you start, using client, customer information, names of people, names of businesses, personal information about them, and feeding it in, we should have some concerns, because there's a privacy policy at the bottom of OpenAI's website, and no, none of you have read it. I know the reality here, even though I'm the one that's drafting these. Those are contractual protections, and that's helpful, but that doesn't prevent OpenAI from using data in a way that you don't want it to.